Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. We will just wait a couple of seconds to allow people to enter the room, and then we will get things started. Thank you very much. Fantastic. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, and welcome to our webinar looking at ambitions for sustainability in Asia Pacific, titled Assessing the Opportunities to Scale Aviation Decarbonisation Across the Asia Pacific Region. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Harry, and I'm the Event Director for Sustainable Aviation Futures Asia Pacific. Sustainable Aviation Futures hosts a series of global aviation decarbonisation conferences, bringing together the entire value chain to network, connect, and discuss the capabilities for scaling sustainable solutions to reach the ambitious net zero targets by 2050. Over the next 60 minutes, our panel of experts will discuss the opportunities for sustainable aviation fuel, strategies, technologies, and policies to decarbonise aviation and the impacts moving forward. This webinar is being hosted ahead of Sustainable Aviation Futures Asia Pacific, taking place in Singapore from the 4th to the 6th of November. Today, we'll provide a snapshot into some of the topics covered at the event, which will include several of our speakers today, as well as being supported by the likes of LanzaJet and Vivo as our sponsors. Our three-day event features over 250 senior leaders and industry experts from across the entire aviation and energy value chain to discuss the announced SAF projects, as well as the exciting roadmaps and prospects for SAF moving forward across the Asia Pacific, as well as the global landscape and innovative low and zero emission technologies that are pretty much exclusive to the Asia Pacific region. Join expert speakers from across the value chain to discover the vast potential for SAF across the world. Webinar attendees will receive a 10% off delegate passes until Friday at midnight. For more details, please reach out to my colleague whose details are on the screen. If you would like to keep ahead of our Sustainable Aviation Futures events and gain access to exclusive interviews and articles, please be sure to subscribe to our monthly newsletter, SAF Spotlight. Finally, before I hand over to today's moderator, a couple of bits of housekeeping. This session is being recorded and will be distributed to all of the attendees after the call. Furthermore, there is a question and answer box that you should see at the bottom of your screen. So please keep the questions coming and our moderator will do the best to get them all answered by the end. If you have a specific question for a panelist, please do reach out to them via LinkedIn or email and we can provide their details at the end of this call. With that, I'm pleased to hand over to our brilliant moderator for today's session, Hoiling Teo, who is founder at Beyond Horizons. Over to you, Hoiling.
Thanks, Harry. All a pleasure to have you join us, and many thanks to the SAF Congress for organizing this webinar. I'm Hui Ling, founder of Beyond Horizons, a specialized legal service in sustainability for the transportation and space sectors, with Singapore and UK teams and a global partner network. Now, you've seen the panelists. We are joined by Flynn at LanzaJet, Gabriel at Asia Sustainable Aviation Fuel Association, Erin at JAVO, and Take at Bloomberg NEF. Flynn, do you want to start off with your introduction?
Sure, Huiling, certainly. So we really appreciate the invitation to participate today. My name's Flynn Van Eyck. I'm the Regional Director for LanzaJet in the Asia Pacific. A quick primer on LanzaJet for anyone who's not familiar with our company. We are an ethanol to SAF technology provider and producer. And earlier this year, we opened the world's first ethanol to SAF plant in the state of Georgia in the United States. That's a plant that's going through commissioning and startup as we speak and should soon begin to produce SAF in the very near future. The company itself is based in the United States, but we have a growing presence here in the Asia Pacific region. I'm based here in Australia. We're now active in 25 countries across five continents, and we've announced projects all over the world, including a number here in Asia Pacific, which I'll be happy to talk about more today.
Gabriel, if you
All
need.
right. Yeah, thanks for having us here today. I see a lot of friends have signed up and it's great to be here. Speaking on behalf as CSO for Asia SAF Association, or ASAFA in short, we're really an independent non-profit association coming together to unite, I guess, industry players like airlines, producers, technology, and investors, and I guess getting policymakers on board to kind of drive the usage of SAF across Asia. We're quite new, obviously. Maybe some of you have heard about us, but we really think that there's so much more to be done as an industry to really get our goals to net zero. So thank you for that.
Thanks, Gabriel. Really important work here. Erin, do you want to go?
My excuse is it's the middle of the night in the United States. Hello, everybody. I'm Erin Heitkamp, VP of Supply Chain Development for Gevo. We are a US-based renewable fuels and advanced biofuel company under the NASDAQ ticker Gevo. Good to be here.
Thanks, Erin. On to you, Take.
Thank you, Huling. So hello, everyone. My name is Takahiro. I work at the Bloomberg NEF. The Bloomberg NEF is one of the organizations within Bloomberg. What we do is to produce research and also data tools to support our clients to make better decisions to make a transition to low carbon economy. We cover various sectors from power to transport, agriculture, and industry. On the individual basis, I cover aviation decarbonization, and then I write up research about various topics, including airlines strategies to reduce their emissions, trends in low carbon propulsion technologies, and also I look at policy landscape in terms of, for example, sustainable aviation fuel mandate, also long-term aviation decarbonization outlook globally. Thank you.
Thanks, Take. So your coverage is obviously really wide. So if we can invite you to talk to us a little bit about the energy transition in aviation and what opportunities, solutions, and strategies currently exist in the APAC region.
Sure. To talk about that, let me share the screen. I hope you can see the screen now. Okay, so let me spend maybe a couple of minutes to talk about our long-term outlooks on aviation decarbonization. So I will talk about two scenarios here by 2050. Before going to talk about APEC specifically, let me start with our long-term outlook on aviation decarbonization in our base case scenario and also at global level. So what this chart shows is that abated CO2 emissions from aviation sector by technologies in our base case scenario. We call it economic transition scenario. So just to note that this is not a forecast, but a scenario that assesses how does energy transition look like in the long term. And this is based on the least cost modeling. And also it assumes no climate change policies that are not announced yet. For example, the future SAF mandates or subsidies that governments have not decided yet. These are not reflected to this scenario. So under this scenario, we expect that the SAF gradually scales. However, in 2050, we expect that SAF accounts only for 5% of the total CO2 emissions abated, which is roughly 5% of the 1.7 gigatons of CO2 emissions annually. The reasons behind are the high cost of SAF and also insufficient policy incentives. And I'm going to talk a bit about APEC region. Next slide. So focusing on the APEC side, this is our short-term demand and also supply scenarios for SAF in the region. So overall, in the APEC, the nature of the sustainable aviation fuel market is still fragmented. Unlike the US and Europe, the APEC region does not operate as a large common aviation market where, for example, the branded mandates for SAF or incentives can be applied to all aviation players at once. So in our base case scenario or economic transition scenario, sustainable aviation fuel replaces 1.7% of the total jet fuel demand in 2030 on a regional level. Although some major airlines, such as Cathay Pacific or Japan's ANA or Malaysian Airlines in Malaysia have at usage target of SAF, let's say 5 to 10% of their annual jet fuel use by 2030, we expect the penetration, the demand growth is relatively limited compared to the US and Europe. This is primarily because of the weak policy incentives in the region. As of today, Singapore is the only country that has a concrete policy for SAF, which is the levy on sustainable aviation fuel starting from 2026. Other than that, most activities around SAF are still voluntary. For example, some of the companies, let's say logistics companies, contribute to pay for the cost premium of SAF to reduce their scope 3 emissions. Without policies, we expect that SAF produced in the region is exported to other regions outside APEC. Having said that, some markets have outlined plans to support the use of SAF. For example, Japan, the Japanese government, the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, or METI, they have proposed 10% SAF mandate and also tax benefits for SAF production. In Korea, the government has amended the Oil and Alternative Fuels Business Act in order to support sustainable aviation fuels. And also Malaysian government has SAF target outlined in its National Energy Transition Roadmap. If there are more farm policy incentives, such as tax benefits or subsidies, we expect that demand will go up more than 1.7% in the chart. This is the last slide I'm going to show. The right-hand side, this chart shows our net zero scenario in terms of the CO2 emissions abated by technology to get to net zero by 2050. So we assume that all sectors have equal carbon budgets, so carbon offsets are not considered in this analysis. So in this scenario, obviously the SAF plays a central role in decarbonization, but we need much, much more SAF than what is planned to produce today. And then it is also important to note that a role of disruptive technologies, such as novel propulsion technologies, including next generation engines, and also alternative energy propulsion technologies, such as hydrogen engines, which is still at the early stage of development. We expect that these technologies are also needed to reach net zero. The reason is that I think probably many of the audience are aware that there's a limited feedstock amount for SAF, and also there's a risk in terms of the potential impact on the land use. Lastly, in terms of the alternative propulsion technologies, we expect that the initial use of electric and hydrogen planes are likely to be limited to niche market, such as short-haul flights with small aircraft. But in the APEC region, some countries in the region have higher potential to replace old turboprops. The countries such as Philippines or Indonesia or Japan or New Zealand, in terms of the geographies and some existence of some remote islands. Thank you. This is our view on the long-term outlook for aviation net zero.
Thank you, Taki. It's a huge challenge. And also summarizing all of the different technologies and touching on them. Thanks again, Taki. So Erin, Flynn, Gabriel, what are your thoughts on SAF and availability of feedstock technology and strategies that could be unique to the APEC region? I want to invite maybe Gabriel to start first, because Asia's Sustainable Aviation Fuel Association, ASEFA, Taki mentioned fragmented markets, lack of policy incentives, no pricing incentives. What does ASEFA set out to do?
All right, yeah, thanks for that. And I'll probably share a few slides, but before that, as an observer not only of the SAF market, but biofuels in Asia in general, it's always been driven by, I guess, the demands from Europe, for example, where there's much tighter legislation on environmental and decarbonization needs. And Asia has always been either producing biofuels or feedstocks supplying to Europe. and that trend continues to be the same even to today with SAF. And finally, I guess there are promising signs on the national level, which is Singapore, Japan really taking the lead to really implement SAF in the next 1 to 5 years. But really, I think when it comes to aviation, it's a really regional, even international play. Airlines fly everywhere. They need SAF in all major airports, small airports as well. To really make this happen, there needs to be a marketplace within Asia. So I think we want to, I guess, let me share this quickly. Let me know if you can see it. Yeah. So really, I think it's open letter to the industry and those on the call, because I think in Asia Pacific, there's so much potential, but we really have to come together, right, as a industry, to really get consensus and alignment on what we want to achieve together. And we're not just talking about, yes, the next few years, we're talking about next 5, 10, 20 years, right? And really for us, as a very neutral, independent platform that really wants to drive the decarb of aviation through SAF, I think we can at least somewhat agree SAF is one of the biggest important levers to really, have a drop-in solution. It's there, technology is there, and I think the rest of the panelists will talk about it later. But really, we see the need to really have sufficient policy in place, incentives, or even hypothetically penalties, right? That if airlines do not do enough, we are, going to be not reaching our net zero targets, right? So we talked about it. Finally, in Asia, I think there have been a lot of reports about, I guess there's so much biomass untapped, right? In Asia, I guess really a fraction, probably 5-10% is actually being used to make renewable chemicals and fuels. And really, I think we need a very diverse and sustainable supply chain in Asia. We can talk about that later on as well, when we think about this whole, I guess, situation about palm, for example. And I think we definitely see a gap, right, in terms of knowledge, expertise, versus our counterparts elsewhere. We see, there's a need to really understand that all technologies can be utilized, and there can be really very efficient ways to start up, build plants, and scale up rapidly, as we've seen in Europe and the US. And we want to build capacity in this region through our association. And last but not least is really investments. Really, all this talk about building plants. I think Taki has talked about it. We need investments to come in, and by and large, biofuels is a bit of a sacred cow, right? I think people kind of understand it a bit more now. But when it comes to first of its kind plants or even newer technologies, the investors generally are a bit, a bit more worried. Let's put it this way. So I think for us, we really see a multi-pronged approach. We want to do webinars, we want to have in-person workshops with policymakers and closed-door dialogues as well. And I think we really build up expertise through our working groups that we put here, technical and commercial working groups, that really work on specific objectives like setting a new, I guess, Asia SAF standard, for example, that can be modeled in our region, just like what's happening in Europe. And we also want to publish position papers and really just get this momentum going, right? Because we've seen a lot of good news coming from Petronas over the weekend. But yet, that's also coupled by, again, not so good news from Air New Zealand today, who said that, the 2030 targets are almost impossible to achieve, right? 10 minutes. So I think we will just really outline what we want to see in the association. We really welcome the whole ecosystem to join us, as well as particular other associations, where airlines or biofuels associations. And we believe the whole spectrum needs to work together, right, to really make this happen. There's again a need to drive the message that SAF is here, SAF is here to stay, and it's probably our best chance at decarbonizing aviation right now. Then more needs to be done, and really we need to get full alignment with governments, policymakers. And yeah, I'll probably hand the baton over to Flynn to cover his side of the story. Thank you.
Flynn, we'll have to trouble you. Gabriel's mentioned the Air New Zealand piece of news. And given that you're in that part of the world, in Australia, not quite New Zealand, maybe you can opine on that, or give us a little bit of understanding on Australia and New Zealand as a region.
Sure, happy to, and I can talk to some of the work we're doing with Air New Zealand to yeah, that news today came out. I don't think it's a reflection of their commitment. It's a reflection of reality and where they think we're going to get to in 2030. So I would first start by saying this region's a really important one for us, including Australia and New Zealand. It's the fastest growing aviation market in the world and offers a lot of opportunity, we think, to scale our technology. As I mentioned in my introduction, we've announced a number of projects here in not just Australia, but the region, where we're working with local partners and developers to advance projects. So just to quickly give you a sense of that, up in Japan, we're working with one of our investors, Mitsui, to help advance a couple projects up there, particularly as Takahiro mentioned, as the government's preparing to implement a mandate for Japan. We have a joint venture in India with Indian Oil Corporation, developing a project on the Indian subcontinent. Here in Australia, we announced a project some time ago with Jet Zero Australia, where we're supporting them to develop Australia's first ethanol to SAF plant up in North Queensland. And that's in partnership with Qantas, Airbus and the Queensland government as well. And then over in New Zealand, we've been working with Air New Zealand and the New Zealand government for some time, looking at the feasibility of converting forestry residues and municipal solid waste into sustainable aviation fuel in New Zealand, and that work's ongoing. So look, these are just the sort of the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot of other opportunities we're working on. Some of those may get announced in the near future. But I guess more broadly, we see this region as one, as I said before, as one with a lot of potential. Those opportunities vary from country to country, and I think for the most part, I've kind of focused on where either policy exists or where it's being developed. So just to give you a sense of what's happening, in Australia and New Zealand, what is really encouraging, I think, is you may be aware of, followed some of this news, that in May this year, Australia's government, our federal government, announced a 1.7 billion Australian dollar investment to help advance SAF projects. That's through what they're calling the Future Made in Australia Innovation Fund. But I think more encouragingly, what they also did was signal a commitment to implement production incentives and also start a process to investigate demand-side measures like a mandate. So that process is underway. They've just wrapped up an industry consultation, so it's headed in the right direction. I think it's also important to recognise, this didn't happen in isolation, and I think a large part, it was a lot of advocacy from industry, a lot of that coordinated through the SAF Alliance of Australia and New Zealand, a body that I've been chairing for the last 6 months, as well as through the Jet Zero Council, which was a government industry collaboration, call it that was set up by our Transport Minister in 2023 to provide advice on just this matter. Similarly across in New Zealand, they've got a similar process, a public-private partnership called Sustainable Aviation Aotearoa. And this has been exploring the policy settings needed to stand up an industry in New Zealand. And through our work with Air New Zealand, we've also been engaging in that conversation as well. So that's also really encouraging. I think it's important not to underestimate the impact that these policy signals can have. Here in Australia, we've got a number of really quite serious projects, not just ours, but others, including a few heifer ones, one that was even just announced yesterday in Brisbane with Ampol, that are being developed. But what's really important is obviously that there's follow through and that these result in substantive policy.
So much, Flynn. Really important words, public-private partnerships. And really glad to hear your views on the journey that you've taken, and that perhaps the rest of the Asian region will have to undertake as well with ASAFA's guidance and support. Erin, thank you for joining us. And with Gevo's journey in the US, what are things that the APAC region could perhaps borrow or learn from?
Right. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Hui-Ling. I will come back to a really kind of directed response to the question, but I want to quickly touch back based on what Take presented at the beginning of the webinar in terms of the massive goal that we as an industry and the whole ecosystem have, and how challenging that can appear if you look at the current state today and assume no change, right? That is, in my opinion, not going to happen. I think we've got a very dedicated global ecosystem of stakeholders who are doing what they need to do to bring SAF to production at scale and to ultimately hit those goals. However, the reality is, especially that 2030 interim target is especially challenging. I think the thing that is really important to level set on is when you think about that really big yellow wedge that Take presented between the years of 2030 and 2040, there's a lot of growth that has to happen there. And one of the biggest limiting factors to that growth is feedstock availability. All of the other challenges that have been mentioned are absolutely critical, right? We need the investment, we need the policies, we need all of that to happen, and to happen in a smart, quick way. But coming back to the feedstock piece, I think for me is where this regional conversation is really relevant, thinking about what we've learned in the United States and what can be transferable. I'm just going to share a slide here as well. So this is not a Gevo commercial, but I wanted to share this to give a sense of our business and the relevance to this feedstock conversation. So Flynn mentioned that LanzaJet is also an alcohol-to-jet company. Gevo is an alcohol-to-jet company as well. And fundamentally, what that means, if you start from a feedstock perspective, is that we need to source at scale carbohydrate-rich feedstocks. The most abundant sources of those feedstocks are crops like corn in the United States, which has historically been where how we have produced all of our SAF to date, or 99.9% of it. But then if you start looking at Asia, to the extent that there is going to be production capacity built across the region, most likely the feedstocks will vary, right? There might be some corn production, but we'll be looking to other things like could be rice, could be sugarcane, could be waste products from palm. There's a broad range of feedstocks. And so the regional solution really is going to have to be focused to some degree on the abundant supply of those feedstocks. That inevitably leads to another conversation that we haven't talked much about yet, which is the sustainability of those feedstocks. How are those crops grown? To what degree are we measuring, in particular, the carbon intensity and carbon value of how those crops are grown, and accounting for that in the models that ultimately determine how we value the fuel in the SAF context. So that's all. That is all really important stuff. In terms of the other, I think for me, regional point that is relevant is that we don't necessarily assume that what we have learned in the United States or the business models that we're deploying in the United States are transferable. As a cut and paste kind of scenario. We are exploring multiple different scenarios. We don't need to own and operate every plant. In some cases, we may ultimately license our technology. We may have business partners that do pieces of the business ultimately to get a plant up and operating, but then maybe we still play a role as the marketer with our relationships with airlines, et cetera. So that is the other part of, I think, thinking about growing this SAF space in a new region for us, especially, is to be really open-minded about what that business model looks like and who your strategic partners are.
Thanks, Erin. Really, really great points. Feedstock sustainability is definitely something that we need to consider, especially as we think about more local crops. And as the APAC region is one of the most diverse agricultural market worldwide, with varying climates throughout the region, varying production methods, and also culturally unique, right? So education levels, language is different across the region. Your point about licensing model is something that we should definitely look at. Take, I don't know if this is something that's Bloomberg has thought about, right? But how do you see the APEC region and its diverse challenges?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think the diversity is definitely there because unlike, as I mentioned earlier, unlike EU, like each single country has own policies and challenges that doesn't apply to all the players in the region. So that's certainly a challenge. There's not much coordination between the different countries yet. What I want to mention here is that there's a mixture of maybe opportunities and also the challenges as well. For example, in terms of, let's say, feedstock, and also relevant to land use as well and the cost. For example, when it comes to the feedstock and land use case, I think that many people probably mention, okay, Asia maybe have more potential. There are more agriculture activities, land. Maybe it might be true. For example, the Australia or China, they maybe have more available land for feedstock, potentially compared to other countries like Japan or South Korea or Singapore, and also some countries in APEC. Let's take an example like China has a lower cost of renewable electricity. That is also important when it comes to producing hydrogen, which is also important for SAF, including eSAF. When it comes to Japan and Korea, the significant challenge, some companies are really working on the technology development in cooperation with companies outside of Japan, and also government is more supportive for SAF. They're discussing. However, when it comes to feedstock, Japan has significant challenge. As you know, Japan has limited land, and also if Japan wants to use alcohol jet, for example, for SAF production, it's likely that Japan needs to import the feedstock from other countries. So Japan is already, for example, importing ethanol from Brazil and the United States. And then when there's a more demand for alcohol jet SAF, Japan needs more feedstock from these countries. Let's move on to Malaysia and Indonesia. I think the local industry may have expectations to use palm oil, for example, palm oil for SAF. I think this is a bit complicated because some countries like the EU are taking more strict stances on the use of SAF. And also some airlines, especially Europe-based airlines and also US-based airlines, are also reluctant to use palm oil as a feedstock for SAF. This is a challenge for Malaysia, Indonesia. On the other hand, I think the airlines in Asia have a different stance in terms of the use of palm oil. For example, I think Indonesia, I think that they are more proactive to use palm oil for SAF. Maybe that could be an opportunity to some extent for the local feedstock supplier.
Thanks, Taki. You mentioned the palm oil, right? And a lot of the conversation in the Malaysian region has been around waste residues, certification, standardizations. Gabriel, do you have any inputs on this? If I understand, you were in Malaysia recently.
All right. Yeah. So this topic of palm is almost on a national level, both in, I guess, Malaysia and Indonesia. I think they strongly feel there's a need to unlock this potential, and it's through sustainable palm. I think let's quantify that. And I think there's been quite a lot of misforgivings about palm in the past. Some of that legacy might still arguably be there, but really the industry really has changed or transformed quite a lot. And sustainable palm is something that I think we can present to industry stakeholders, right, across the globe. And I guess for policymakers, it's close to their hearts that those who I've spoken to, they want to see not only just the palm residues, palm waste, they want to see the entire palm fruit, right, per se, to be used for, high value products like SAF or renewable diesel, right? So I think that that conversation needs to be had, as much as it's somewhat challenging. I think we as industry has to look at it more pragmatically as well, because we probably want to, I guess, defossilize first, well, and decarbonize a little more later. I think that's the way forward. And perhaps, I think as Take has kind of alluded to, maybe here in Asia, right, we can use what's found in Asia to drive the SAF industry, to drive renewable diesel or marine bunkers, right? Let's use what we have, and take those steps forward, right? And we can count on, advancements in carbon capture, or I guess climate smart technology, soil management. There's a lot that's happening in I guess Europe, even US, that we can bring to Asia, right, to improve the, let's say, carbon intensities of palm and other food crops, right, energy crops. So yeah, we like to really kind of see that the future is brighter than we assume, and not let, I guess, certain legacy issues cloud this discussion.
Thanks, Gabriel.
Mm.
Erin, if I believe you have some information for us on land use. Yeah, this could be quite relevant to the discussion point on what sustainable feedstock could be, how to calculate it.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I do, and I'm happy to share. I really liked your comments, felt like introductory comments to me, Gabriel, because the idea of defossilize then decarbonize is, I think, practical and smart. And I think when we're taking these steps, I like that approach. I also am a little gun shy, as I'm sure some of you also are, in terms of what the response is going to be to taking a step in a certain direction without really, really rigorous data to back up your claims about the carbon value. And ultimately, there will be other conversations about the sustainability value of the changes that are being made to produce jet fuel in a different way. So the first slide that I am going to share is really a kind of a look back on why I think we have collectively a little bit of PTSD about this topic. And I will apologize about my tech savviness here. I'm not figuring out how to get these to show up right away the way I want them to, but here we are. So this slide really gets to this issue of, if you think about the conversation around corn as a feedstock to produce ethanol, as the ethanol industry scaled in the United States, there was a lot of conversation around, okay, so the renewable fuel standard in the United States creates a substantial financial incentive for farmers to produce corn to be sold into the ethanol industry at the time, and still today. And there was a lot of concern about, well, what kind of incentive is being created to take land, say, out of conservation reserve, or to cut down forest lands, or primary grasslands, in order to put that land into production to produce corn for this purpose. And that led to a whole conversation around the corn and as a feedstock for biofuels, and the ethanol industry being wholly unsustainable as a blanket statement. And then there was another global conversation that has been refuted around kind of food versus fuel, as the idea that we're creating these incentives. And so now farmers are producing corn that used to go into the mouths of people who were hungry and needed it for sustenance, and now we're producing fuel instead. Looking back, most of those claims and concerns have been invalidated. And so I think this is a lot of data, but the summary statements are that if you look back on land use in the United States over a 100-year period from 1920 to 2020, we've actually seen a decrease in the amount of land that's in agricultural production. And that is largely tied to increases in productivity. So there's a flag right there, right? Because the farming model in the United States is not the farming model in Japan or Australia or Malaysia or wherever, right? There's different climates, different suitability for crops, different soil types, and perhaps the biggest issue is the size of the average farm, right? So if in the United States, your average farm is 600 acres, which translates into about 200 hectares, that's a pretty large scale farm in a lot of the APAC region. Having said all that, the point here is we need to think about this stuff and we need to take it seriously. But the potential is there through innovation and technological improvements in agriculture as well to continue to increase productivity on the land that is available for crop production that can then become feedstocks for SAF. In addition, we have all sorts of new technological innovations that can support the validity and visibility and traceability and transparency of the supply chain. I want to make one other point here, which is that just because you can be really confident in the crop feedstocks that are being grown in a certain way, such that you know that there's carbon being sequestered in the soil, that there's a reduction in the life cycle carbon emissions associated with fertilizers that are used, that you have a more sustainable farming system because of the regenerative production practices that are being used. You can observe that, you can improve it, you can validate it, but ultimately, if the policy programs that are creating the mandates and incentives to produce these crops for the purposes of producing SAF don't recognize that value, there remains a major barrier in the marketplace. And so really what I wanted to present here for further discussion is that if you look globally at the many different programs that create the incentives and or mandates, so if we look at California GREET would be the low carbon fuel standard in the state of California. CORSIA is the global standard for decarbonization of aviation under ICAO. RFS stands for the renewable fuel standard in the United States. I can go across all of these, but if you look at the specific particular carbon emission contributions and how they're accounted for or not accounted for in each of those models and frameworks, there's a lot of variability there. And so inherently there is variability in terms of, in particular, how much financial value can be created and brought into the ecosystem and shared. So all of that is to say we are a huge fan of the Argonne National Lab GREET model. It is our North Star because it incorporates the latest science. It includes agriculture and everything that agriculture has to contribute. It's updated annually. It's publicly available and generally well understood and considered to be a platinum standard. The results can be readily verified, et cetera. So while we know that the GREET model is not going to be universally adopted around the globe, I think the principles around why we support it and what the GREET model stands for, I think are really important as we think about incentives and mandates across the region being developed in order to spur and support the growth of the industry.
Thanks, Erin, for sharing and introducing all of the different standards that are being proposed, that it varies across countries, economies. So this is where I think there is a visible tension, right, as between one country and the other, depending on their economic situation, you know, where their business industries are, their labor policies, how to keep people employed. So very policy-driven governmental issues come to mind when we consider the different methodologies. Flynn, in your work in public-private partnerships, how has this been addressed? LanzaJet has charted the path of ethanol to jet in the Australia-New Zealand region. You know, that's a little bit less tested than the traditional heifer method. Have you been grappling with public agencies on similar, what kind of challenges are involved, maybe in relation to like implementation, enforcement, getting everyone to agree on a standard?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, Hui-Ling. I think maybe just to draw on some of the other comments that have come before this. I think it's important that any policy is obviously right-sized for each country. And that's been part of the conversation here in Australia. What's right for Australia? What's going to work in the Australian context? Same in New Zealand. And I think that really comes to life when it comes to discussion around sustainability criteria. Yes, there's the CORSIA criteria that do set a good standard from a criteria perspective, but there's certain things that are relevant in Australia that aren't necessarily reflected in the CORSIA standard that need to be, I think, accounted for. Equally, I think on the life cycle assessment tools, we certainly share Aaron's view on GREET as a tool, and probably best in class in that respect. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Takahiro, but I think Japan's chosen to go down the GREET path too, or were indicating they would in that respect. So yeah, I think that's the importance of bringing industry and government together, is to work through these issues, to understand what needs to be accounted for, what needs to be considered. The Asia Pacific, no question, Asia Pacific, one of its biggest strengths is feedstock, and the vast potential in terms of feedstock production. But it's really important, as was already pointed out, that we don't lose sight of the risks and the challenges that come with this from a land use perspective. So having those robust sustainability criteria and LCA tools has to underpin any policy that that comes to be.
Thanks, Flynn. Gabriel, in your work with ASEFA, perhaps responding to what Flynn has highlighted, that it has to be specific to each country, its geography. Are there any nuances that you think would be particularly relevant for the APAC region, excluding Australia and New Zealand?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think it's a sobering fact that I guess Asia is pretty big. If we talk about India, China, Southeast Asia, Japan, Korea, for example, adding all that up, a lot of people hasn't been on the plane yet, right? And I think a lot of middle class, they all aspire to see the world. And aviation is just going to grow day by day, right? It's going to be, I guess, IATA estimates the biggest region by far, right? By even 2040. I think what's happening is really different countries are finding ways to, as a national level, not just aviation, just to become greener, to, decarbonize their, countries per se. Aviation's been put, I guess, much on the forefront, right? Because again, we need planes in Asia, right? Like you're not stating the obvious. And we do feel like there could be more support for more interesting projects, for some kind projects. We again examined the aeronautic jet already quite in detail, but there's so much potential for, I guess, fisher choke, from biomass or municipal solid waste. I think briefly, even eSAF looks interesting in certain regions where there's abundance of green energy. You could actually consider that eSAF production. And even as we speak, there are new pathways, right? Pyrolysis of plastics, 3D mass. There are many more technologies coming our way, right? I think Asia needs to take advantage of all these technologies, right? And it can only happen probably with, again, private or maybe more public pushing through governments financing, or at least de-risking many of these projects to make it more bankable. So I think that's where we see we kind of have to rely on, I guess, the industry to come together, right, to really build the foundations and get it right this time. Because like it or not, I think biofuels in the past has been off to quite a shaky foundation and still is today. And hopefully SAF's going to change that, right? So yeah, over back to you.
Thanks, Gabriel. So we're almost into Q&A time, but Flynn has asked Take on the LCA methodology in Japan. I don't know, Take, if you want to take that, or if you want to maybe talk about infrastructure for staff, just to close us off.
Sorry, the question is about, is your question?
GREET methodology and its application in North Asia, in Japan, or what you're seeing on something we haven't yet talked about in respect of infrastructure for SAF supply into airports, getting it into airplanes.
Yeah, for GREET questions, I actually am not very familiar whether it's applied in the Japan context. For the airport infrastructure, there's some projects are ongoing. For example, like Narita Airport, I think that they have launched a joint venture with the gas company to develop the sustainable aviation fuel production infrastructure there. In the long term, they are also planning to have a renewable energy plants and also the hydrogen production plants near the area as well.
Thanks, Taki. So we have now all the questions, or some questions, coming in from the audience. Harry, do you want to take over, or happy to go through question 4, which Erin has kindly said she would respond on? Okay, so question 4 is, can the industry afford such substantial investments required for research, development, and infrastructure to support decarbonization efforts? Erin, do you want to take that?
Yes, I'm happy to take that one. So I think my really quick answer is we can't afford not to. I mean, the practical reality is climate change is at the door. That is a foregone conclusion. Aviation has a significant part to play in decarbonization, and that part is only going to get bigger. To the point that Gabriel made, we still have the majority of the world that's never been on an airplane. And from an equity and accessibility perspective, we need to make that possible and open up the world to every human, right? And so we have to do this. At the same time, I think there is, just to do a really quick reality check, if you look at that yellow gap on Take's slide that he shared in terms of the amount of growth that has to take place in SAF production and how much of that ultimately has to come from, I'm just going to focus on alcohol to jet as a production pathway because it's what I know best. The practical reality is you're talking about $1 billion of capital plus or minus for every one of those plants. We need 50, probably more than 50 of those plants to come online before 2040. So that sounds like a lot of money. And it is, but this is not the first industry to look for that kind of capital to stand it up, right? So we need that money to come from lots of places. And so the roles that governments play in unlocking the capital, I think, is really important, whether that comes in the form of policy incentives or making debt capital available. I have to give the Department of Energy in the United States a huge amount of credit for the program that they have right now, which is a loan guarantee and relatively low cost, substantial loan that you can access as a producer. Obviously, lots of things that go into that, but it's that type of support that really makes the difference. And then the other thing I guess I would say is that the long-term commitment that the airline buyers are making through offtake agreements is absolutely essential. Without that long-term revenue certainty, both the debt and equity providers that make the production of those facilities happen is not going to be there. So those are the 2 points I wanted to make. Thanks.
Thanks, Erin.
Can I add something on the question? So some governments are really heavily supporting the research and development for various technologies, including SAF and also other low carbon propulsion technology for the long term. When it comes to SAF, I because I'm speaking from Japan, maybe I'll raise the example from there. So the government has set up the funding called Green Innovation Fund, which supports the early stage technologies for various sectors to decarbonize, including aviation. And then the government's the Ministry of Economy and Industry, and the METI, actually they have been supporting the research and development for example, alcohol jet technologies by providing subsidies from the Green Innovation Fund. Again, I completely agree with what Erin said. The government's financial incentive for early stage technology is very crucial as the industry is still at its stage, and then the industry needs to diversify the technologies and then feedstock as the amount of available SAF is very limited. And then currently the most SAF comes from HEFA, but certainly there's a limited feedstock. So yeah.
Thanks, Taki. Anyone else? Flynn? No? Okay, we have a couple more questions. So, Taki, maybe this is one for you as well. EU has come up with additional schemes like Refuel EU and also the 2% SAF mandate supply from 2025. What kind of similar initiatives do you think we can expect from the APAC region in the future to meet the 2050 net zero goal?
So no countries in APAC has a similar level of regulations as the EU, because the EU, the Refuel Aviation, it's mandate, and also there will be penalty if stakeholders cannot meet that target. But then, having said that, some governments are discussing and somewhat similar policy mechanisms. For example, Singapore, as you know, Singapore has decided to apply SAF levy from 2026, and then the target is 1%, and then it goes up to 3 to 5%. Japanese government has proposed 10% SAF mandate to fuel distributors, and then they are thinking to reflect to that act, and one of the acts here, but it hasn't been decided yet. We also hear some governments like Malaysia or Korea government are also discussing, but the concrete policy has not announced yet.
Thanks, Taki. Flynn and Gabriel, any thoughts?
Yeah, I might just add to that. Obviously, there's some good examples in the region of policy emerging both on the mandate, the demand side and the supply side. It's, as I said earlier, that's what Australia is exploring. We have a strong view that for this time is of the essence, right? And for us to lift this industry and to build it in the timescale we're talking about, to sort of Erin's point before. You need strong, robust supply side incentives married or coupled with demand side measures such as mandates and designed in tandem to work in tandem. For that reason, we think the UK proposal with their mandate to work hand in hand with a revenue certainty mechanism is a good example. But it's going to be challenging without sort of policy or proposals like that for us to really scale production to where we ultimately need it to be.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, just a gentle reminder that many parts of Asia, fossil fuel still being subsidized. We're really talking about gasoline or diesel, right? Land transportation. So I think for governments, they really have to look at it holistically. How can they, I guess, slowly move away from so-called subsidies in fossil fuels and at the same time activate, right, this green economy, right? And I think SAF is part of that conversation, and I think our own estimates point to by 2030, probably on average, across Asia is probably going to be like 3% of average usage of SAF. But beyond that, I think we really look towards, I guess, UK is a great example of a policy that's comprehensive and gives certainty for investors to come in. We like to see more of that in Asia, really. So
thanks, Gabriel. Harry, do we have more time, or I don't want to drop out of this call unceremoniously. If not, we will thank our panelists.
Unfortunately, that takes us right to the hour, and in fear of us all getting kicked out. Thank you so much for everyone's participation, Gabriel, Erin. Flynn, Take, and thanks for the wonderful moderation as well, Hoiling. Again, loads of questions that we weren't quite able to answer. If you do have a specific question for one of our panelists, please do feel free to reach out to them, and we will also do our best to share as many of the informative slides that were presented throughout the hour as well. Once again, thank you so much for joining us today. Hugely appreciated, and some really fantastic insights and discussions that took place. For more information on how you can hear 3 days worth of this content, please do reach out to one of our team at Sustainable Aviation Futures. But with that, thank you all so much for your participation. Thank you very much, and have a fantastic rest of your day.